Hi, and welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. Today, I am joined by Lena Pripp-Kovac. Lena is a partner with me in Fractal CSO's boutique consultancy, and she brings a really interesting mix of experiences, having studied many of these issues in college and worked for Ikea, and brings a very European viewpoint, but also works a lot in the States. So she bridges that divide. And one of the things that really struck me in this conversation, I think there is a myth in the United States that the Europeans have this figured out. And I think the tension that is ESG, DEI, sustainability, and figuring out how to balance business and societal needs and where there are win-wins and where there are trade-offs to be made is alive and well in Europe as it is here in Asia and elsewhere. And so bringing in that interesting European perspective and sharing thoughts and what's worked and what hasn't was the hallmark of this conversation, which I thought was fabulous. Hope you enjoy it. Lena, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Looking forward.
Yeah, great to have you with us. So you come from a European background. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing, but now are based in the US. Tell us a little bit about your views on the differences and this idea of kind of interpreter is a role that you've talked about in relationship to sustainability.
Yes, thank you. Pleasure to be here. I have come to acknowledge that the more I worked with sustainability now for many, many, many years, I've seen myself interpret actually what it means. And sounds a little bit funny, but the fact is that when you work with business development or you work with innovation and you happen to look into the sustainability impact of that, it actually takes some time to interpret it and also translate into different languages. So when you look into an innovation and have a business and a business case language, you see it in one perspective. And then you look at it from a sustainability perspective, you might actually use other words and other ways of explaining that. And I've come to see that more and more to try to see the same picture when you actually develop your business and develop your portfolio for innovation or whatever you are looking into. You actually have to spend some time to see the same picture because you have such a different language and such a different view of looking at things.
Well, it's interesting too, because this idea of interpretation or translation, there's a skill set there, but there's also like a core value of empathy, of understanding the other's point of view and trying to kind of walk a mile in their shoes to understand what's driving them. Jim, when I talked to him, he talked about the idea of the key questions he asks leaders are what keeps you up at night and how are you bonused, which is another means of doing very similarly to what you're describing.
I think that is exactly the case. And I also think that is maybe the sustainability profession's dilemma, right? We are quickly jumping into not actually understanding the other person's view. That might have the role of need to keep your employees, make the next customer satisfied for the next development, or the whole worries about getting the financial P&L together for the next quarter. We as sustainability professional has to take that on too and put that into the view of the company. So I think we both have that need to understand each other's and also see what we're doing together rather than as two different things. Sustainability is not just cost. It is also value creating, and it also maybe has another timeline. So when you look at the short-term perspective versus the long-term perspective, the sustainability team might look much more into the long-term perspective, whereas the business need is in the short term. But you actually have to do both. You need to sprint and do marathon in these things and can't just pick one or the other.
Well, it's interesting because like taking this kind of like understanding the other's point of view, empathizing, is in some ways countercultural in the modern moment as these issues become highly politicized and we live in the world of identity politics and cancel culture. Culturally, and not necessarily inside business, because I don't think this is true inside business as much as it is in our general societies. We have a habit of, oh, he's a Democrat or he's a liberal. My dad once said to me, he goes, well, you're a liberal. And the way that he said it was with such disdain, it was shocking to me. He didn't mean it as a description. He meant it as an insult. And I think that's broadly true of our culture. And so in some ways, this is a countercultural role.
I see that even more in the US than I did when I work in Europe, even though I see the same tendencies there. And I think the interesting thing there is to go beyond that when it comes to sustainability. And maybe that's why I feel that the interpreter role is even more important than ever, because instead of kind of classify or make yourself having an identity, I am a sustainability person, I am a business person, I am a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm liberal, or whatever it is, actually look beyond that, because the sustainability is so much more fact-based need. And when you look through the lenses of all these different, the identity, then you actually lose what you want to do. I think most people want to have food, right? They want to make sure that the nature around them are healthy when they go out and play with their kids, and they want to have the environment clean to breathe and things like that. So if you actually look into the facts behind some of these things, I still believe that we have very common values: health of our family, being able to provide food, and then live a nice life with our family and friends. And in order to do that, you actually have to look into the impact of environment and social and financial in a business. So it's so important to go beyond that identity, I think, and really start to look at the values you want to have and the future you want to have for you and your kids.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. You said that you see this less in Europe. And why do you think that is? I mean, in Sweden, I would assume it's a more homogenous culture than the United States, but also sustainability is more mainstreamed and less questioned.
Actually, it's changing a lot in Sweden too. I mean, it's not so homogeneous anymore, and maybe that's also a big change. I think it's much more polarized here, I feel, in the US. It's very sensitive right now. It's very important how you say something rather than what you actually say, which I see as a big difference. I do see that happen in other countries too, though. And what I see now with the sustainability, the worst thing that could happen is actually that it becomes some kind of political view rather than something that you work on the topic level. And what I see, the difference here, many companies in the US has come a very, very long way. I live in the Bay Area where the innovation and technology changes and the possibilities of what you can do is amazing. But then there is also some that doesn't even want to talk about it. It's like they do work with renewable energy. They're changing systems and they're making an enormous impact on the environment and people, but they don't want to talk about it because of the polarization and the climate talking about these topics. Whereas in Europe, I sense that you talk more. Yeah, so you might not do more, but you talk more. And there's a need to align with people that you have common values with in order to collaborate. So I'm not saying you need to do things, but you also need to talk about it. But the balance there is very different between Europe and the US. And I get a little lost in that because in the beginning, I actually thought that people didn't work so much with sustainability here. But after being here now for a while, I realized that there's a lot of things being done and good things are being done, but you just don't want to talk about it.
Well, in the U.S., conversation's always been, let's not talk about carbon, let's talk about energy efficiency. Let's not talk about XYZ issue, let's talk about its antecedent. And in some ways, that's what the business case of sustainability does, is it just changes it from, and I tend to agree with this, changes it from a moral or ethical conversation to a business case and the value that is derived from it individually or collectively and the profit that can fall from it. And I think 80% of the time that's appropriate. But as Jim and I discussed, and as I've discussed with other guests on the podcast, Andrew Winston said companies shouldn't be exempt from having conversations about right and wrong. And I agree with that as well, in the sense that sometimes the business case isn't perfectly evident, and it still seems clear that the company should be doing something. And I think, interestingly enough, companies leaving Russia after the invasion of Ukraine was a good example. It took something like 20 years for as many companies to leave South Africa due to apartheid as left in the first year after the Russian invasion. It just became like a norm that you wouldn't continue to do operations in Russia under those circumstances.
Yeah, and I think now, hopefully, also many companies have better view of what is happening in their supply chain. So when you do that, and these things are happening, and the geopolitical changes, you also know that you have to be very present in your supply chain. And if you can't be present, like the case in Russia here now, it's also very hard to do business because you will never know if you have human rights violations or if you have a severe environmental impact. So I think that one thing that has changed during all these years is the visibility and the presence in the supply chains actually make you realize that you have to make swift and more adapt a lot to changes in society. And that takes a lot of guts. And you have to be brave in that, both because you're going to be criticized either way what you do. But you need to make sure that it goes with your company values and it goes with what direction you want the company to go, even though some of those decisions are really hard and not at all black and white.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because it really is a question of responsibility, because for a long time, the downstream effects within your supply chain really weren't your responsibility, and companies didn't accept that responsibility. But now that is less and less accepted as an explanation. I mean, I'm trying to follow the whole Boeing case, and it's interesting because, as I understand it, many of these problems, or some of the problems, were within one of their suppliers, and then they had to go in and repair something, and when putting the repaired door back in, they forgot the bolts and blah, blah, blah. And so it's interesting, but it doesn't really matter where the problem started. It matters that it's Boeing's aircraft that they're selling. So independent of who's on first, like they're the ones who are responsible at the end of the day.
And I think that's a great example. And what is also going, both you have the responsibility of your supply chain, actually the visibility and the presence in the supply chain, whether you have partners or it's yourself, it doesn't matter. You are actually working on the same agenda. And you're bringing up actually also the public, society and customer reactions to that. The expectations in society has changed. And I think a lot with, internet and the ability to get information and the massive information that is actually being circulated now, which again makes the point on interpreter even more. Just by reading everything in media or on internet, it's very difficult to get a true picture of what's actually going on, because there is so much information that try to explain the impact. So how do you today, as a customer or a business leader, actually assess the situation? And here again, I think you need to be extremely bold and have courage to make decisions and stay with your decisions rather than trying to figure out 100 different views of what's going on. So, because you have the responsibility. And what I find interesting with sustainability now is that the business cases you talk about and your innovation portfolio is still in a time frame that is easy to assess. You need to have a business case. You need to have an assessment of your innovation portfolio that is good from both a business, social, and environmental perspective. But as a leader, you also have to make decisions that will impact the company and the society long after you're actually not in the company anymore. And that is also another type of leadership, actually setting ambitions and goals that go beyond your own mandate, if I put it that way, and challenging, and also not what people have been doing for many, many years. You want to have the goals that are within your own impact, but you actually have to look out maybe 20, 30, 40 years ahead, because you're setting direction of this company success and also impact on society on a longer view than we are used to.
Well, and I think that's right. And the conversation on long-term, short-termism has waxed and waned in the sustainability conversation, and kind of comes and goes. And I don't think we give it the due that it deserves. And it, to the point we earlier discussed, why is that? Because all of our incentives are short-term within business. Profit is quarterly. Incentive packages for leaders and everyone else throughout the company are annual. Like, very few people within a company have 5, 10, 15-year bonus or incentive programs,
And then you feed the incremental change setting, right? So it's going to be incremental changes and efficiency changes and not necessarily innovative changes that change your business model. So I agree. I mean, that is the incentives, but it's also an interesting thing to see if we continue as we've been doing with these incremental efficiency changes, which has been good historically, but we are now at the point, either you're a company that realized, well, we've done so much, what are we going to do now? Because you're coming to the tipping point where you really have to do more systemic changes rather than incremental changes. Or you're a company that just steps into this and realize there's so much here to do, I don't even know where to start. Here, I think the direction of the long-term marathon will be more and more important. Otherwise, we'll just stand doing little changes as we've always done and really not embracing all the values and possibilities that we need to do.
I couldn't agree more. What has surprised you most about as you've switched from the European focus to the US focus?
I think the fear of setting ambitions and goals externally. And I also think the fact that you have set some values and then you change. I'm thinking about some of the commercials around, beer companies here lately, for example, that when you have a value, whether it's a diversity goal or something, and then you get pushback from society, one part of society, you retract very quickly and apologize rather than just stand your ground and realizing that, my customer base is diverse and big. A minority of that can make you change very quickly. Maybe that has been the most surprising, actually.
I really agree with that. I'm thinking about Bud Light.
The fear behind that is surprising.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because they ended up losing their market share and losing any positive bounce they got out of with the gay, lesbian, trans community or their employees or whomever they were trying to court at that moment. They really lost on both sides because they blinked, but it's interesting because, the question is what's the cautionary tale, right? Is it that they shouldn't have done anything or was it that they blinked? And I think it's that they blinked.
Yeah, I think so too, because I do think that, you have to make sure that you know your values and your company customers. And then from there, you make your decisions rather than, a big media campaign or something that is coming around the corner. So that one is hard. And then maybe a more funny little thought I had when I came over here is that how you talk about climate is quite different here compared to Europe, where the climate agenda and the Paris Agreement is on top of the agenda in a different way. But then I also thought about the interpretation discussion again, and a colleague of me here actually mentioned that, you have a goal where you talk about 1.5 centigrades or lower, right? And in the US, you actually have Fahrenheit. So for the general public, you don't even speak the same language on the ambition. Not only is it hard to understand for anyone what that actually means for the climate, but you're also talking about centigrades instead of Fahrenheit. And that kind of is a point that I can see. We're talking about these ambitions in Europe a lot on that sort of higher umbrella level, where here in the US, it's been more, what does this mean for me? And that's a healthy discussion. And as long as it doesn't mean that you throw out everything around the Paris Agreement, but you actually, again, interpret it and translate it into what it actually means for you.
I think that's right. I love this concept of interpretation, translation. John Davies, GreenBiz, has talked about the CSO role, Chief Sustainability Officer role, as a Chief Translation Officer role. And I think that's right.
As a last point, I would also say that doesn't mean that sustainability professionals are translating for business. It is equally important that business people are translating for sustainability people. So there is this importance of understanding each other. So it's not one right? You actually have to use different languages to understand each other. What does it mean? And I find that more and more important than ever if you're going to make those big movements that you need to do, both from an environmental and social perspective.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I really had fun talking to you.
Great to talk. Take care.
Thanks.